He never wrote his name on a single bottle, never appeared in a single photograph next to the man the whole world would eventually credit. For over a century, his name didn't exist in the official story at all. Not once, not anywhere, not even in passing. And yet, without him, the world's best-selling whiskey wouldn't exist. In 1866, deep in rural Tennessee, a young orphan boy registered what will become the most recognized whiskey brand on earth. Today, that brand is worth $4 billion. Its black and white label sits in bars, homes, and airport duty-free shops on every continent. Nearly every person who has ever tasted it knows one name, but almost nobody knows the name of the man who actually taught him how to make it. For 150 years, that name was missing, not by accident, but by omission, buried underneath a simpler, more comfortable version of history. A version where a kind local preacher taught a struggling orphan everything he knew, and the rest was destiny. Then, on the company's 150th anniversary, something almost unheard of happened. The brand itself stood up and admitted the story wasn't true. Not entirely. Not even close. The real teacher wasn't a preacher at all. He was an enslaved man, born decades before freedom would ever reach him. A master of filtering process so precise, so ahead of its time, that the whiskey it produced would one day be recognized across the entire planet. This is a story of how a technique born in bondage became a global empire's most guarded secret, and how one name, erased for a century and a half, finally found its way back into history. He was the 10th child, the youngest of 10, born into a family that already had more mouths than it could comfortably feed. His mother died before he was even old enough to remember her face. Gone within months of his birth, leaving behind an infant nobody quite knew what to do with. His father remarried, and for a while, that might have been enough. But the relationship between the boy and his new stepmother turned cold, then hostile, then unbearable. Historians still don't agree on exactly what happened inside that house, but whatever it was enough to make a child decide that running away was safer than staying. He wasn't a teenager yet when he left, still small enough that most people would have called him defenseless. And in the rural hills of Tennessee, a boy with no family, no money, and nowhere to sleep didn't have many options. He found one, a local preacher who also happened to run something the church officially frowned upon, a whiskey still. The preacher took the boy in, not out of charity exactly, but because an extra pair of hands was always useful on a working farm. The boy milked cows. He fed pigs. He hauled water back and forth from the well. Day after day, the same exhausting routine that thousands of farm children endure without a second thought. But there was one thing on that property that wasn't ordinary at all. Smoke, rising steadily from a building near the edge of the farm. Men moving in and out of it constantly, hauling mules, wagons, barrels. Always busy, always secretive. The boy asked about it more than once. Every time, he was told to stay away. Until one day, he wasn't. The preacher finally gave in to the boy's curiosity and led him toward the smoke himself. Inside, the air was thick with heat and the smell of fermenting grain. And standing at the center of it all was a man the preacher introduced with a single sentence the boy would remember for the rest of his life. This is Uncle Nearest. He's the best whiskey maker I know. The boy had no idea what he was looking at. No idea that the man standing in front of him, quiet, skilled, and completely unknown outside that farm, would end up shaping the rest of his entire life. His name was Nathan Green, known to almost everyone simply as Uncle Nearest. Born around 1820, most likely in Maryland, into a life that gave him no choice in the matter. Whether he was born enslaved or became enslaved later isn't fully documented. What is documented is this. By the time he reached the preacher's farm in Tennessee, he wasn't just working the still, he was running it. Nearest had mastered a technique almost nobody else in the region understood. Filtering raw whiskey through sugar maple charcoal before it ever touched a barrel. The process stripped away harshness, leaving behind something smoother, cleaner, more refined than anything the surrounding farms were producing. Today, that exact technique has a name, the Lincoln County process. It's the single legal distinction that separates Tennessee whiskey from ordinary bourbon. But Nearest didn't invent out of nowhere. The method is believed to trace back to West Africa, brought over by enslaved people who had already been using charcoal to purify water and food long before they ever touched a whiskey still. What looked on the surface like a simple farming skill was actually generations of inherited knowledge that would eventually define an entire American industry, credited for over a century to someone else entirely. At the time, this wasn't unusual. Enslaved men made up the majority of skilled distilling labor across the American South. They weren't just doing the manual work. They were often the ones who actually understood the craft at its deepest level. History simply chose not to write their names down. The boy who'd been led into that smoke-filled building didn't know any of this yet. All he knew was that the whiskey coming out of Nearest still tasted better than anything else nearby, and that the man standing over the barrel seemed to understand something nobody else did. So he stayed, and he watched, and slowly, day after day, Nearest began teaching him everything, not the preacher. Nearest, for years, the two of them worked side by side, one an enslaved master distiller with nowhere else to be, the other an orphan boy with nothing left to lose. Nearest taught him the filtering process step by step, how to control temperature, how to know, just by smell, when a batch was ready. Skills that had taken Nearest decades to refine, passed down in the span of a childhood. The boy grew older. He got good enough to start selling whiskey in nearby towns himself, discovering along the way that he had a rare talent for something Nearest never claimed to have, convincing people to buy it. One man could make it, the other could sell it. Neither of them could have known that one of their names would end up on every bottle in the world, and the other would disappear from the story for the next 150 years. The Civil War changed everything. Soldiers needed whiskey, and the boy, now a teenager, found soldiers willing to buy from him directly. But the same war that built his customer base took his father from him. At 15, he was completely alone in the world. No parents, no family land, nothing but a trade he'd learned from a man the law still considered property. Around him, the preacher was facing pressure of his own. His congregation had tolerated his whiskey business for years, but tolerated wasn't the same as approved. Eventually, they gave him an ultimatum: the pulpit or the still, not both. He chose the pulpit, and he sold the entire distilling operation to a boy who'd once fetched his water for $25. In 1866, that boy registered the business under his own name. It became the first officially registered distillery in the United States. And with slavery legally abolished a year before, Nearest, now a free man, was hired as the distillery's very first master distiller. In the Reconstruction-era South, a black man holding that title, at that level, was almost unheard of. Nearest's sons eventually followed him into the trade. So did his grandsons. For over 150 years, in one form or another, a member of the Green family has worked at that same distillery. A quiet, unbroken thread running underneath a story that spent most of that time pretending he barely existed. The business grew. Then came Prohibition. 2 decades where the whiskey couldn't legally be sold at all, forcing barrels to sit untouched in warehouses across 3 states. The founder himself never lived to see it end. His death, when it came, was almost absurd. Frustrated one morning that he couldn't open his own office safe, he kicked it hard enough to break his toe. The injury turned infected. The infection spread. Within 5 years, it killed him. No wife, no children. He left everything to his nephew. Decades later, in the 1950s, the brand was acquired by a larger corporation, and its first real advertising campaigns began. Celebrities did the rest. Frank Sinatra called it Nectar of the Gods and reportedly requested to be buried with a bottle in his hand. Today, it's the best-selling whiskey on the planet, worth $4 billion. Sold in duty-free shops nearly 1 million times a year. But for 150 years, one name was missing from every single bottle. It wasn't until 2016, on the company's own anniversary, that it finally admitted the truth publicly. The boy didn't learn this craft from a preacher. He learned it from Nearest. One man's skill, another man's name, and a century and a half before the world found out which was which. If a story like this deserves to be remembered correctly, it starts with more people knowing it. Share this with someone who's never heard Nearest Green's name before, and subscribe, because history has more names still waiting to be found.